So I'm really delighted to welcome Avi Melamed back to the Israel Connection on Zoom today. We're speaking from my prison cell in Victoria, Australia. We have curfew now, Avi, between 8 o'clock at night and 5 a.m. in the morning, but it's not quite as bad as it sounds. But I wanted to talk to you today, Avi, about the Palestinian situation, which is what I've been looking at in some detail in the last couple of days. And by your own assessment, Avi, based on what you read in the Palestinian media and your contacts in the Palestinian community, what do you see as being the overall attitude toward Israel at the moment? There was much noise, as we both know, from the Palestinian leadership over imminent moves by Israel to declare sovereignty over some of Judea and Samaria. But now, how have the Palestinians themselves responded to all of this fuss that was being made about annexation?
Well, David, shalom from Israel. Thank you for having me. My pleasure. Actually, the simple part of the answer is that nothing really substantially have changed in the way Palestinians view Israel, meaning in the context of the annexation, you got more or less kind of like one Palestinian front, either Hamas or Palestinian Authority, that actually say, you know, this is totally rejected, it's not going to happen, we will not going to let it happen, we will do whatever we can to stop and prevent the annexation, and so on and so on. But I think that in the context of the way the Palestinians look at Israel, I think it's important to understand the way the Palestinians look at themselves today, because that is very significant. The bottom line of what I'm going to say is simple. The Palestinians today are in a rock bottom. I think perhaps maybe in the one of the most deepest crises ever. There are different reasons for that. I'll just try to make it very shortly. One reason is, of course, the Palestinian split. Hamas on the one hand, Fatah, Palestinian Authority on the other hand, since 2007. And by the way, in the context of the annexation, there was a joint statement made by a senior member of Fatah, Jibril Rajoub, formerly the head of intelligence services within Palestinian Authority, together with a senior member of Hamas, Salah al-Arouri. They both made a joint statement talking about joining forces and fighting the annexation. No one among the Palestinians really believed that, unless in the Arab world. That shows you how deep the situation in terms of the inner Palestinian split is. The second thing that is also causing the Palestinian crisis is the fact that the Palestinian issue has totally been pushed aside in the agenda and priorities of the Arab world. The Arab world today is engaged with the problem of the hegemonic vision of Turkey and Iran. The Arab world is engaged with COVID-19. The Arab world is engaged with enormous economic and political challenges. And honestly, there is also a very deep sense of like the Arab world is really like fed up with the Palestinians. And this is a very significant component as well. We had some good examples of how that impacted the whole story of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship in the last couple of years. You may remember following the moving of the US Embassy to Jerusalem in May 2018, or following the recognition of the US administration on the Israel sovereignty in the Golan Heights, there was nothing really significant done in the Arab world other than some rhetoric and some very shallow diplomatic statements, no mass demonstrations, no nothing. That, by the way, applies as also in the context of the story of the annexation. So it shows you once again how dramatically the whole issue of the Palestinian issue was pushed aside in the Arab world. Another reason for the Palestinian crisis is, in a way, ironically speaking, because to a certain extent, both in Gaza Strip, ruled by Hamas, as well in the Palestinian Authority, ruled by the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank, there is some sort of stability, relatively speaking. By the way, they both so far successfully passed the test of COVID-19. The death rates and the infections statistics in both Gaza Strip and areas in the West Bank controlled by the Palestinian Authority, the statistics are very, very low. We're talking about few cases, just so you could get a perspective, which is an interesting story for itself. So there is a sort of stability, relatively speaking. I talked to people, for example, in Palestinian territories a couple of months ago, young people mostly. The major sentiment that is expressed is the one that actually says, we don't really believe in the story of another round or military round. We are kind of like exhausted with that. We don't really believe the leadership, the Palestinian leadership, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority. What we are looking for is ways to improve our life. We want nice apartment, we want a new car, we want a good education for the kids, we want a decent job. And this is a sentiment that is expressed quite strongly. And by the way, in that context, something very significant, there is a large numbers of Palestinians, particularly young Palestinians, that if they have the opportunity, they just leave, either from the West Bank or from the Gaza Strip. Statistics are not so clear, but we are looking at some decent numbers. We are talking about thousands, in some cases even dozens of thousands of Palestinians that are living, migrating wherever they can. It also an expression, of course, of this deep skepticism and pessimism in that sense among the young Palestinian generation. So all in all, that's the situation currently within the Palestinian inner discussion. And obviously that radiates also in the context of the discussion of the annexation, in the sense that the Palestinian Authority, as well as Hamas, trying to design the upcoming steps towards the story of annexation, they must be tuned to those circumstances within the Palestinian people, both in Gaza Strip as well as in the West Bank. And that's also present the leaderships, meaning Hamas that controls Gaza Strip and Palestinian Authority, that present them some significant challenge and dilemmas. What exactly should they do? How should they move ahead, trying on the one hand be committed to the Palestinian cause or some core issues of the Palestinian cause as they define it, but on the other hand, how not to rock the boat too much, because that rock is already a little bit unshaky. You could see that Palestinian leadership is struggling with the question how to deal with that. And one last thing in the context of the Palestinian Authority, everyone there are basically taking positions towards the chapter or the day after Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. He's already mid-80s and his wealth is not very, very good. And there are already different factors within the Palestinian authorities that are starting, actually for a long time, to position themselves towards the day the struggle over the crown will start within Palestinian Authority. All those things together in the end of the day results in a situation that for Palestinians is quite gloomy, and no wonder then that a major sentiment that, as I expressed before, is the one that actually says, you know what, leave us with politics and all this stuff. We just want to have some good, decent life for ourselves and our kids. And this is something that comes across very well, both in Gaza Strip as well as in the Palestinian territories.
I've been seeing, as you said, Avi, that there have been very, very small numbers at some of the demonstrations before July 1 was supposed to happen. They were very, very small numbers. And clearly there was no concerns as far as Israel was concerned that if they went ahead with any form of annexation, that there'd be a huge uprising in the Palestinian territories. That wasn't an issue. But what I would like to go on to ask you here is, what the sentiments you've been expressing seem to echo those from a writer that I came across, a woman, Marwa Fatafta, who's a researcher and policy analyst for Al-Shabaka, the Palestine Information Network. And she expressed the following sentiment in an article that she had published there. And I'll just quote a little bit of what it said to begin with. Palestinians recently ranked corruption as the second largest problem after the economic crisis, higher than the Israeli occupation. Palestinians generally view Palestinian Authority officials as a self-serving elitist group disconnected from the Palestinian struggle and the people's daily suffering. Despite this dissatisfaction, there's been little change. What remains are the old guards maintaining a grip on power, rampant and systematic corruption, and the alienation of Palestinians from participation in decisions that impact their lives and future. So this seems to suggest that the Palestinians can really blame their leadership primarily for the predicament that they're currently in, and it also is quite evident that there's a character to the Palestinian society. She calls it in her article a neo-patrimonialism. Perhaps you want to comment about why the Palestinian society, in the way the leadership is running it, is so resistant to change.
Well, first, I think she reflects very accurately a very authentic sentiment. By the way, it's not new. I mean, it's been around for a long period of time. Palestinians both, vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, as well vis-a-vis Hamas, many Palestinians says, like, you know, those are two organizations or groups that are very corrupted, and this is a sentiment that is very much out there. Now, as I said before, I mean, there are attempts within Palestinian society. I met, for example, young people that are engaged, Palestinians that are engaged in NGOs, grassroots activities, trying to generate more and more civil society values and activities within the Palestinian, and that for itself is a good news. The issue is that the political structure, the split of power within the Palestinian society, whether it is the Palestinians in the West Bank and, needless to say, Palestinians in Gaza Strip, it presents a very difficult challenge for a change, and particularly if it is a change that actually offers in a way an alternative, a political alternative. Both Hamas and Palestinian Authority, and particularly the old regime, sort of speaking, the Fatah, major Palestinian organization, are very much sensitive, sort of speaking, about their political power base and obviously maintaining and ensuring that power base. Now, when they come across activities that, and I have to emphasize that have the potential to be sort of like more grassroots, impactful activities, both Hamas and Palestinian Authority will make that process happen, but they will very closely, they will monitor it. In other words, they will make sure that it will not go beyond certain lines. They don't want it to go beyond certain lines. So there are voices and there are activities that are holding the Palestinian leadership accountable for what they are doing, both Hamas as well as the Palestinian Authority. There are attempts to create sense of like new political alternative, but those attempts as of now, for the reasons I mentioned before and others, are kind of like restricted, both in their scale as well as in their impact.
Now we're going to listen to a short audio clip from an event that I have had a look at from a group called Free Palestine Melbourne. And there was a participant there from the group that I've just mentioned, Al-Shabaka, a woman by the name of Dr. Yara Hawari, a researcher at Al-Shabaka. So let's have a listen to this, Avi, and then I'd be interested in what comments you have after we've heard it.
Decades of Israeli military occupation have, of course, led to all kinds of issues within the healthcare system, namely acute shortages in medical supplies and staff, very sort of limited facilities being built. Indeed, Gaza hospitals pretty much constantly run at zero stock, which means that they have less than a month's supply at all times. I'm going to run by some figures here so that you can sort of get an overview of what the healthcare system looks like. In the West Bank alone, there are only 255 intensive care beds. That's for a population of 3 million. In Gaza, there are 120 intensive care beds for a population of 2 million. In the West Bank and Gaza combined, there are only 6,440 hospital beds. Now, I mentioned earlier the word de-development. De-development is a term that was written about quite extensively by the scholar Sarah Roy in the context of Gaza. But what it means is that actually this the sort of donor culture, the donor context, means that Palestinian civil society and Palestinian infrastructure institution have actually not been developed, have actually faced a purposeful and deliberate process of de-development. And to give you an example, health clinics in Gaza have actually gone down over the last decade from 56 health clinics to 49, and yet the population has increased massively. Additionally, in the West Bank and Gaza, you can't even get the above basic healthcare. So operations such as, heart operations, anything to do with cardiac care, cancer, eye surgery, all of these things, you have to be referred to a hospital in East Jerusalem or in 48. And this is at the mercy of the Israelis giving you a permit to do so. So overall, the health system is pretty bad, and I would say that it's collapsing under the current crisis. And I want to stress importantly that Israel is not a regime in this case which is adding or exasperating the situation. Israel is actually directly responsible for this situation in the West Bank and Gaza, and I've dubbed it as a regime of comorbidity. Meaning that it has direct responsibility, and indeed, in the case of the West Bank and Gaza as an occupying power, it has a responsibility under international law to provide for and to take care of the very people that they occupy. Now, of course, this is not being done, and actually, there is a rather sick narrative that was going around at the beginning of the pandemic, that there was cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis, and maybe that this would lead to some kind of peace, that finally the two sides are seeing eye to eye. In reality, what this cooperation was Israel allowing tidbits of medical supplies donated by international donors into the West Bank and not even allowing the full amount in. So Israel is being praised for doing something which it should be doing itself. And this was a narrative that was quite dominant in the mainstream media, and quite a sick one at that.
So, Avi, what do you make of the remarks from Dr. Yara Hawari that were very critical, it seems, of the health system in the Palestinian territories and the lack of cooperation she claims with the Israeli authorities?
Well, I must say that I'm a little bit puzzled. The reason for that is that I just happened to see about 2 weeks ago an interview with the Palestinian Minister of Health, Dr. Mai Al-Kila, and she was interviewed to a Palestinian radio station in Arabic, of course. She was interviewed to a radio station called the Palestinian Youth Voice radio station. She gave a long interview, and she was talking in length about the situation in Gaza. The bottom line of what she said in the interview was that the Palestinian Authority streams constantly medicines and medical equipment to Gaza. She was very clear about it. She said all the medical needs of Gaza are being fully and immediately, she emphasized immediately, are being fully and immediately responded and addressed by the Palestinian Authority. She mentioned that the only thing that is lacking in Gaza Strip was radiological treatment. And she said that people or patients that needs that treatment can have the treatment either in Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank or in Arab states. In that case, she also praised the cooperating, coordinating system, and she said that when Palestinian is leaving Gaza to get the treatment, the medical treatment, it has to be in confinement like for 14 days, and when he or she goes back to Gaza, they have to be in confinement for 21 days. But the picture that she was presenting in that interview was very different from what we heard right now on this audio clip. And my tendency will be to assume that the Palestinian Minister of Health knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, I suggest that you're right. In this program or this online event that I was watching from Palestine Melbourne, further on, Diana Boutou remarked that in the West Bank, the Palestinian hospitals don't have any radiation equipment for treating cancer patients. And I think this is a move that was imposed upon them by Israel, because I believe Israel probably is very concerned about putting this type of equipment into their hands for security reasons. Would that be the case?
I don't know what she was referring to exactly specifically. Maybe she was referring to some specific issue. Again, and I'm quoting the Palestinian health minister. By the way, it was very interesting in this interview because the host of the interview, the anchor, she was like praising the Palestinian Minister of Health for like long minutes, talking about how wonderful the system is functioning, both in West Bank and Gaza Strip, and how satisfied people are. Obviously, that could be some sort of a flattery, but on the other hand, it shouldn't be viewed only as a flattery. There may be some things with specific with this thing of radiation of cancer. I'm not familiar with that personally. I've never heard about it. I cannot therefore validate what Mrs. Butcher was saying.
Okay. Now, what is actually going on with the security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority at the moment? Now, we know in protest at Israel's planned occupation, the Palestinian Authority halted security cooperation with Israel, impairing police and intelligence work that benefited both sides. Now, the authority has also stopped accepting taxes, I believe, that were collected on its behalf by Israel. And in the resulting budget crisis, most officers in the PA ended up receiving only partial pay, and some have been skipping work. So it sounds like things are a little bit out of control. So what is the current situation with regard to the security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority?
To make a long story short, David, the security cooperation continues. The channels of communication remains open. Still, we are looking at a situation where both Israel and the Palestinian authorities, for their own interests, both separately as well as jointly, have an interest in the continuation of the work of the intelligence and security apparatus, the flow of information, and so on. The crisis, the budget crisis, was solved. I don't know to say if it was fully solved. It may not be fully solved, but I know that on just the other day, you may know there has been a major a Muslim holiday, Eid al-Adha, the last weekend. So before that, money was streaming back to pay people's salaries. Obviously, the last thing the Palestinian Authority needed at this point was people that are supposed to celebrate that big holiday and they don't have money in their bank account. That is not a good situation. The whole story of the flow of money, cutting the budget, renewing the budget is constantly back and forth. But as of now, to the best of my knowledge, it has been renewed.
So is there any serious threat that the Palestinian Authority would be dissolved if Israel were to proceed with some form of annexation, that people would give up finally on them because of seeing it as a complete failure of them to deal with Israel?
Such concern exists. And it's not. It shouldn't be lightly looked at. It shouldn't be, pushed away.
Shouldn't be brushed aside.
I'm sorry.
We shouldn't brush it aside. It's not. It is a serious possibility, you suggest.
Well, look, it's a possibility. I know that this is a possibility. Intelligence agencies are also engaged with or studying that. That goes, as I said also before, with the whole story of the question what's going to happen in the post-Abbas time. there are different scenarios. One of them is that scenario. I personally tend to more assess that there may be aftershock waves. We may witness some tense times and tense incidents, but I think that the Palestinian system at whole in the West Bank will sustain those aftershock waves and could be restabilized. So personally, I think that though the scenario of possible dissolving or disintegration of Palestinian Authority should seriously viewed, I don't think that that's what's going to happen with the Palestinian Authority, at least not given to the current atmosphere and circumstances. We have to also remember that one of the things that shapes very much today the story of the Palestinians is what's going around in the region. I referred to that earlier when I was talking about the shift or the downgrading of the Palestinian issue within the Arab agenda. But another thing which is very significant, the Palestinians are looking around, they're looking at what's going on in Arab states, the power struggle, the need to address the challenges across the Middle East. And one of the things that the Palestinians rightly conclude is that nobody has a magic solution. Nobody can come today and say, oh, I have the cure that will cure, oh, just give me your voice. They, in that sense, I would say they kind of like grew up in a way and basically are much more pragmatic and sober approach towards the reality. Therefore, one of the ramifications of that is there is a less tendency to generate chaos or total instability, because in the end of the day, as they can see very clearly in different examples around them, that is not going to result in stability. That is going actually to result the opposite outcome. So I think that this is another one yet significant reason for my assessment that I believe that we will not witness the disintegration of the Palestinian Authority.
Perhaps you can explain this basic question for me and my listeners. What is the exact relationship between the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization?
The PLO is actually a frame that back then, when it was established in the mid-60s, included within that different Palestinian organizations. And by the way, overwhelmingly, the different Palestinian frictions groups that were included with the PLO were mostly coming not from the Islamist side, but roughly more from what I call the national statehood supporters. That has to do with some other issue that maybe some other time we'll talk about, the whole big power struggle in the Arab world between Islamist and statehood, a fascinating issue for itself. The major factor within the PLO was the Fatah organization. The Fatah organization was established already back in the late 50s, and it was the major factor within the PLO. Now, when the Oslo Accord was signed between Israel and the Palestinians in the 90s, as part of the agreement, now the PLO was actually becoming the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, to a large extent similar, is also, again, based mostly upon the Fatah organization and some other Palestinian organizations, not including the Islamist Palestinian organization, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other organizations. Hamas and Islamic Jihad were established both in the back of in the late 80s of the late 1980s. So that's roughly speaking the issue of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, and the Fatah. The Fatah is the biggest organization within the Palestinian Authority, as it used to be the biggest organization within the PLO. And by the way, the frame of Fatah and others exists parallel to the frame of the Palestinian Authority, meaning their constitution, their institutions, their establishments continue to operate in parallel to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, is also the chair of the Fatah organization.
So if the Palestinian Authority were to be dissolved for some reason, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, would be the one that would have the task of taking over control of a replacement for the PA. Would that be right?
It will be predominantly the issue of the Fatah. Look, today there are roughly speaking 3 major players in the Palestinian political arena. I'm saying major in the sense that each one of them has the ability to impact substantially both the inner Palestinian arena as well as the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The 3 major factors are Fatah, that I mentioned before, the major pillar of the Palestinian Authority. Fatah, roughly speaking, has a stronghold in the West Bank. And the second 2 are Islamist Palestinian organizations. Hamas, that rules Gaza Strip since 2007, after he crushed in a violent coup the control of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza and kicked out Fatah people, Fatah militant people, military forces from Gaza Strip. There are Fatah people in Gaza as well, but they are obviously under very tight control of Hamas. And the third Palestinian organization is also Islamist, and this is Islamic Jihad in Palestine, mostly acting and operating in Gaza Strip as well. It is the second largest military organization in Gaza Strip after Hamas. The 3 organizations, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, I'm defining them as major, again, in the sense that each one of them separately and in the case of Hamas and Islamic Jihad also together can impact substantially the inner Palestinian arena as well as the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The gap between the Fatah on the one hand and the Islamist Palestinian organizations, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the gaps are substantial, actually to the point many really in the Arab world wonder if those gaps are really bridgeable or can be bridged. In that context, one more thing very significant. Hamas and Islamic Jihad has also some strongholds in the West Bank. In some areas, there even we are talking about stronghold, like substantial one. And the Fatah, the major factor of the Palestinian Authority that rules the West Bank or parts of the West Bank, as well as the Palestinian Authority security forces that to a large extent are actually Fatah people, are spending a lot of effort and energy to suppress all the time and to prevent Hamas and Islamic Jihad from trying to duplicate in the West Bank what they did in Gaza Strip in 2007.
Who is the stronger then in the West Bank, Islamic Jihad or Hamas?
No, Hamas is stronger, obviously in Gaza Strip, Hamas rules, and also in comparison to the Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, Hamas also is stronger in the West Bank. But the issue about Islamic Jihad is very significant because Islamic Jihad, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad obviously vote to eliminate Israel by the use of violence. The issue is that while Hamas as a ruling factor in Gaza Strip also subdue his policy and policy making and decisions to the need to act as a sovereign in Gaza Strip. In other words, he needs to provide people with healthcare and medical services and all other things. Islamic Jihad is not dealing with that. Islamic Jihad is 100% the fight against Israel. Now, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad obviously are cooperating to a large extent because they share one big interest, and this is to wipe the state of Israel off the map. Islamic Jihad has both the military capacity as well as the willingness to actually dictate military rounds, even if Hamas is not so much interested. Actually, Islamic Jihad in Palestine did that in 2019 more than once, and that causes some frictions or tensions between Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And Hamas actually needed to mention Islamic Jihad in Palestine, that in the end of the day, there are other calculations that has to be taken into consideration, and not only the issue of let's start shooting rockets at Israel and whatever. There are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza Strip, and Hamas needs to take care of these people because he controlled them. So you see here, there is a source of tension between the two. By the way, in the context of the annexation, my assessment was and still is that if there is going to be, because Hamas actually said annexation is a declaration of a war and we will act accordingly, I think that in the case of a potential military move in the context of annexation, I think that this time, differently from previous times in 2019, for example, I think that Hamas and Islamic Jihad will coordinate. They will act in a frame of one joint frame,
yes,
and will avoid a situation where Islamic Jihad once again will act independently, dictate some military round upon Hamas against Hamas wills or in circumstances that are inconvenient for Hamas. So I think that will be the case if we'll get there. Today, Hamas has no interest today in military-wide collision with Israel, and to a certain extent, Islamic Jihad at this point is tuned to Hamas needs. That could change.
Well, we know we're speaking about one of the most volatile places on the planet when we talk about the Middle East, aren't we, Avi? Now, I want to ask you your opinion on this question. Where to now for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? In an article in the Jerusalem Post that I came across by Nadav Tamir, who's a board member at MITVIM, the Israel Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, and a former diplomat and policy advisor to President Shimon Peres, he referred to two different approaches. Firstly, he talks about the pessimistic approach, where the prospects of an arrangement with the Palestinians are non-existent, and all Israel can do is manage the conflict, as it's been doing, of course, for a good long time. The Palestinians will never accept Israel as a Jewish state, according to this pessimistic approach, and won't ever give up on the right of return. Now, the optimistic approach, on the other hand, is the rejectionist approach that has shifted from the Palestinian side now to the Israeli side. And a change in our attitude could result in a breakthrough, a change in the Israeli attitude, that is. Gone are the days when the Palestinian leadership advocated terrorism and rejected every peace initiative. Since Mahmoud Abbas replaced Arafat at the head of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian leadership has taken an official and practical stand against terrorism. And given an Israeli partner, Abbas believes in bilateral diplomacy. Absent one, he turns towards multilateral diplomacy. He instructs his security forces to cooperate with the Shin Bet and IDF in countering Hamas terrorism. He has accepted the principle of land swaps and the demand for a disarmed Palestinian state. So with this optimistic approach and the pessimistic approach, where do you think we're going to go? Have you got a crystal ball?
Yes. I'm always saying to people, look, I know the answer, but I can't share it with you. It's too confidential. David, let me tell you something. I've been saying that 30 years ago in my positions and 20 years ago and 15 and 10 and 5 and today. Israeli-Palestinian peace is not an achievable objective. It's not because I don't want peace. It's because simply the two people are in a place where they can't really have really peace in the Western mindset or meaning of that term. I always have been talking, and particularly I would say more than ever today, about possibilities to set arrangements on the ground, because I'm always saying to people, look, Middle East is not about necessarily peace. It's about arrangements, practical arrangements that could be and that could endure and sustain for a long period of time. And from time to time, they need to be maintained and adjusted. The same apply here as for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I think that given to the whole huge turmoil in the region, in the Middle East, the change of priorities in the Arab world, the challenge presented by the hegemonic vision of Turkey and Iran, the power struggle within Arab states over their path and identity and direction. All these are huge things that actually reshape the Middle East and inevitably also impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm always saying, look, I know there is a tendency in the world to say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict shapes the Middle East. That is inaccurate. It's the other way around. The Middle East shapes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict trajectory and course. And in that context, I think that, for example, today we have some interesting opening, interesting window that could lead to a path of ending not in a peace, but ending in some sort of an arrangements on the ground that could be sustained. If there is one thing that is worse than not having a peace, is having a peace that will collapse the next day. So, given to the circumstances in the region that I've described before, and also a very significant factor, though some people are kind of like underplaying that or undermining that, but I think they are wrong. President Trump's peace initiative should not be brushed. There are people who looked at it and say, well, this is nothing, it's no significance, but I think they are wrong. You know, I published an article shortly after the peace plan was published in the beginning of this year. I wrote an article and I explained why do I think that peace initiative is significant or has a potential to make such a change. And I said that one of the major things about this program is that first, it is much more accurately dialoguing with the reality of the Middle East in comparison to the guiding narratives that dominated the Western mindset. Yes. This is one thing. And the other thing I think it's very significant is the fact that that approach actually tries to create a different foundation for a discussion, basically departing from narratives that proven, it's not a political assessment, it's a fact, departing from Western narratives that have been proven time and again for the last 30 years as failed, because they failed, departing from those narratives and approaching a new road that actually goes along the line of arrangements. And I think that I published that article very shortly after the peace initiative was established, and the reactions that came from the Arab world actually validated my assessment. Because when you look at the reactions coming from the Arab world, and I'm talking about the beyond the scenes, the indirect, the hidden messages, but you could find it very easily. The messages that came from the Arab world to the Palestinians was, don't rush to brush this initiative. That initiative can offer a base for a discussion, for negotiations. This is very significant. It is very significant. Remember that the whole issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was to a large extent the attempts to solve that, at least from a Western perspective, were dominated and guided by narratives, Western narratives. Some of them are very idealistic and some of them are very noble. The only problem with that is that they don't dialogue with the reality of the Middle East. Once you are applying a policy that is dialoguing with the reality of the Middle East, and the reality of the Middle East is not the same reality that it was not 5 years ago, 2 days ago. When you apply such a policy, you may have a better chance to achieve some sort of foundation that you could start build upon it, an arrangement structure. It's a very long-term process. Don't hold your breath. There's not going to be peace with the Palestinians tomorrow morning. It's a long process, but I think that today we may have opportunity to generate a process towards possible some practical arrangements on the ground.
Yeah, from my view, seeing the Trump plan providing so much economic improvement to the Palestinians, and with the Palestinians being mostly concerned about their economic situation, it just would have to be very attractive for them to adopt the plan in some shape or form. But that was the way I saw it. I know we're going to refer to your crystal ball again just before we finish up. Who do you think will get Abbas's job? Will it be Jibril Rajoub, or will it hopefully be somebody else? Have you got any predictions as to who might take over the leadership?
No, there are different names mentioned, and I wouldn't like to speculate. I mean, it's all kind of like, the speculations about names, who is going to replace him. I wouldn't go that direction. We'll just have to wait. I think my belief is that we'll see once again sort of more of a shared power, meaning we'll see a couple of power base, not one. Couple of power base that actually will find ways to assemble together sort of a joint, I would say, frame in which each part or that assembles that frame could ensure some of its interest. I don't see a situation where one person is climbing up to the top of the pyramid and that's it. It will be, in my mind, something that will be more horizontal. It will be reflecting more the split of power between different groups within the Palestinian Authority, particularly the Fatah organization.
So just to finish up, Avi, how are you coping with your work these days? Obviously, you're doing things very differently than normal. You would have been trekking across the United States, giving lectures in many communities, but this hasn't been able to happen for you. So how are you adapting to the new world that we're living with now under COVID-19? What are you doing to get your message across?
Well, David, thank you for the question. I'm doing what we are doing right now. I'm providing lots of briefings, Zoom briefings about different aspects of the Middle East. I'm working with all kind of audience, Jewish federations, synagogues, Jewish community centers in the world, and I'm glad to say that it's gaining momentum. I mean, I personally wasn't used so much to that type of work. I'm kind of like more of a in-person sessions and briefings. I had the opportunity to be in Australia a couple of years ago. I had a long series of lectures in Australia, and it was a wonderful experience. But I found myself enjoying the ability to really keep people updated, educated about what's going on in the Middle East. This is my job, to really try to educate people. We are really trying in our work, myself and my wife, she's also part of this work, Maya. We are really trying to provide up-to-date, cohesive information about what's going on in the Middle East, staying away from narratives and concepts, and really trying to educate people. We believe that our mission is really to try to, through the educational process, to help people regain sort of control over their ability to read the world generally in a time where people are just overwhelmed with endless amount of information, and when in a time where people feel that they are kind of like have no ability or no tools to sift through this huge amount of information and to have some picture of reality that will be resembling a reality. And this is what we are doing. We are providing this educational knowledge either as a one-off sessions or as a series of briefings covering different aspects of the Middle East, obviously, of course, talking about the impacts on Israel. And we have a great feedbacks. It's very warmly welcomed, and obviously we are hoping to further continue and expand that activity.
Well, I can only thank you today, Avi, for your contribution to my program and what I'm trying to do in depicting a broad picture of what's going on within the Palestinian movement and with the Palestinian leadership and people themselves. And I think you've provided certainly a lot of fantastic insight today into what's going on in that regard. And I hope that I'm sure that my listeners and those who watch this video that we're producing today will also be able to achieve a lot of understanding that they wouldn't get from going to other sources, that you have a unique perspective that you can provide for people, and that people can see that and will really appreciate it.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.